Sometimes great characters are simple. Complexity is not a necessary component of a good character, but when complexity is done right, it can add a lot. Some of my favorite characters in stories are built around duality. So when a character has interesting, conflicting personality traits, it can make them feel so much more human. And when it's done poorly, it actually does the exact opposite. Welcome to a running series called Exploring Frieren. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about when duality is done right. So duality is built around contrast, specifically between two different concepts. Take for example Naruto. There are multiple cool examples of duality in his character, like his general irresponsibility juxtaposed to his unwavering will to fight against what feels unjust, or his grandiose self-centered ambition opposed to his total lack of hesitation to sacrifice things for others. What makes Naruto such a special character is the duality that's consistently offered. He's annoying, but endearing. And I find my favorite characters consistently exhibit these traits. There are tons of outstanding examples in Avatar: The Last Airbender, but mine and many other people's personal favorite is Iroh. Introduced first as a simple man that is lighthearted and unserious, he eventually evolves into one of the most substantial characters in all of media. There are tons of cool parts of Iroh that exist in contrast. His lighthearted, silly nature opposed to his hardened military background as a general. There are things like him supporting Zuko and then secretly working against the Fire Nation. But today I want to look at a very specific example of a remarkably well-written character that exhibits duality, that can teach us so much about character writing in general. To no one's shock, given this series and my channel, today we're talking about Frieren. There's this common misnomer that complexity equates depth. I think simple things can be incredibly deep, but when it comes to characters, it feels like complexity can add so much, especially given that primary characters need to have compelling story arcs and complexity can lead to conflict. Overcoming struggle is an incredibly important part of character arcs, and well thought out duality leads to interesting conflict. But this is really hard to do well, because when you're building a character, any mistake in the equation can cause a cascading effect of things not working. Stories are built around the suspension of disbelief. If fundamental parts of the story stop making sense or feeling right, like a house of cards, everything can suddenly collapse. But stories are also fighting for your attention, so they have to make things make sense without taking too long explaining them. Audiences need to stay engaged. So writing stories requires many different acts of balancing. Not the duality we're talking about here with characters, but another form of duality. Man, I keep saying that word a lot. It's almost like I'm making a video about it. So let me explain what makes Frieren such a well-written character and great example of duality for those who aren't familiar or those who don't see it. This story takes place after the hero's journey. Frieren is introduced as one of the 4 party members that saved the world from the Demon King. It's a character-driven story that's obviously built around very charming and interesting relationships between different characters. Conflict is incredibly unimportant, which leads to a show that feels in some ways very slow, but in other ways very precise. It wouldn't exactly be wrong to say that at times it feels a lot like a slice of life, but then true to the fantasy adventure, in a way that almost feels random if it weren't for the fact that it fits so perfectly into the story, the show will crank it up to 11, including outstanding fight sequences that are on par with some of the best animation I've seen in recent years. And it does all that without it being a primary focus of the story. Honestly, there's a whole video in that topic right there that I'll eventually make. But at the center of all of this is the namesake of the show, Frieren. I think she's an outstandingly well-written character, but I think it's a little slow to start. There's this archetype in anime called a kudere, the cool, seemingly emotionless character who hides behind a veil of mystery. Too often, kuderes end up being completely uninteresting as writers forget that there should be something behind the mystery. Now, Frieren ticks all the boxes for this classic archetype. Light hair, a name that literally means cold, and so many scenes, especially in the pilot where she doesn't express much emotion. But what initially makes this character so interesting is how quickly they subvert that. She is a charming, silly character who's incredibly emotionally expressive, but still struggles to connect with those around her. Her personality runs perfectly in line with this exploration of the everlasting elf, and the ultimate story is about Frieren learning to value her relationships more and the brief time she has to share with the people around her. She's such a fun and interesting exploration of this trope. And after 10 episodes of all these little adventures that seemingly have such slim stakes, it becomes easy to forget the context in which she was originally introduced. She's an incredibly powerful mage who saved the world from the Demon King. Which leads to this fun moment that I've seen in a couple other pieces of media, but never really explored in this way, where the main character becomes the boogeyman for the bad guys. So this has been done a couple times. The most obvious examples I can think of are John Wick and Batman. So in Nolan's Batman trilogy, there's this thing they do a lot where they jump into the perspective of the bad guys, allowing the audience to see how scary Batman is. It felt like a horror movie except for the fact that the monster was the good guy and we were on his side. There's also that iconic scene from John Wick where he's not the boogeyman, he's the guy you hire to kill the boogeyman. Every time I've seen this decision played out well, it's so fun, but it's almost always badass characters. Well, sometimes it's a cute elf. I really like the way Frieren did this, not just because it was cool or because it ties into the duality of Frieren's character, but because there's so much more. There are so many fascinating themes in this story, like Frieren's relationship with magic, or later when she's defined as a mage made for an era of peace. But part of what I found so fun about it is she's introduced as this badass character, and then across 10 episodes we forget that. Okay, so this is the point where I'm going to start throwing in some spoilers. So this is going to be through episode 10 of Frieren Beyond Journey's End. So when it comes full circle, and 10 episodes in, we're introduced to some demons who are acting as antagonists. We end up finding out that they call her Frieren the Slayer. She's literally the boogeyman for these monsters. Frieren as a character up until this point is so overwhelmingly charming, all built around these little imperfections and faults. I actually made a whole video exploring that concept. I'll link it in the card right now. So there's the first introduction to Frieren as the badass mage, and then she grows into this charismatic, charming character. We're given all these little reminders of how badass she is, but then it's shown in full, in arguably one of the coldest scenes in the entire show. Frieren's face-off against Aura the Guillotine is fantastic. A mix of Aura's powers and hubris lead her directly into a trap. One of the reasons duality is such an effective character writing tool is because contrast is incredibly intriguing. You can set stakes by having characters contradict pre-existing character traits. For example, if you make a silly and happy character stern, it really sets the tone. Or having a calm and collected character show visible stress and pressure. Frieren is built around this entire adventure that happened before our story even takes place. We only get small snippets of it here and there. But time and time again, Frieren's character shocked me, eloquently dancing around all these conflicting character traits. She's 1,000 years old, but at times comes across as incredibly youthful. She's the mage that saved the world, but she doesn't really take herself too seriously. She's one of the most powerful people in the world, but she doesn't care much for fighting. She's so capable, but also falls prey to silly habits. Frieren is absolutely badass, but she's so many other things first. She's a sweetheart, but also very scary. She's likely just one of many different characters that showcase the value of duality in character writing, but I do think she's a great example. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.